Welcome to our program on Kardec Radio.
Welcome, dear friends, to Kardec Radio in another health and spirituality program. We've been doing this for more than 10 years. And you know that there are many wonderful minds joining us to share the much they have discovered to enhance the quality of our lives. Especially during this pandemic, we are being called for more than 2 years to evaluate the quality of our lives. And hopefully, we have realized our priorities. And today, we're going to talk about a disease that is happening without, when we least expect someone in our families are diagnosed with Alzheimer. And treatment is it's still in the works. There are therapeutics to minimize its effects, and yet, do we have enough to bring some form of relief, quality to the lives of patients and family members who care for them and caregivers in general? Here in Northern Virginia, we personally have been in touch with an organization, the Arbor Terrace. It's a place where they care for people with Alzheimer, memory loss. And we've been volunteering there in our community at the Spiritist side of Virginia for a few years, getting in touch with patients who experience the drama of Alzheimer. We have a lot to learn, but we're not the experts. We have here with us the expert in the field, Dr. Stephen Post. As I prepare to bring him to you, he's here with us, thank God. You know, Dr. Post has been with us before at Kardec Radio and our Spiritist organizations throughout the U.S., which is a blessing for us. He has an extensive curriculum, but I'll bring some highlights as you can also follow it in his very website, stephengpost.com. And he is the best-selling author of a book that became renowned, Why Good Things Happen to Good People, How to Live a Longer, Happier, Healthier Life by the Simple Act of Giving. He is professor of preventive medicine and bioethics at Stony Brook University, the director and founder of the Center for Medical Humanities, Compassionate Care at Stony Brook University. And he has extensive work in so many other areas, including with youth internationally. We have already talked about it in the past. He has been working with so many leading minds in this greater understanding of life. You can read more again at Stephen Post, stephengpost.com. Are you ready, friends? Here is the website for you. Here is. Thank you so much, Dr. Post, for joining us today once again. How have you been?
I've been pretty well. You can call me Stephen, and I'm going to call you Vanessa.
Thank
Dr.
you.
Anseloni.
Oh, please. All right.
It's wonderful to see you. It's truly nice to see you. It's been a while, and I've always enjoyed your programs, and it's just a delight.
Thank you. And it's a joy for us because we are willing to learn more from you. I know you don't stop. You always have more. And now there is a new book coming out. And this new book, for those who are with us, will be at Amazon and many other places. It's Dignity for Deeply Forgetful People, How Caregivers Can Meet the Challenges of Alzheimer's Disease. My first question to you, I know you work in the fields of compassionate care, but why did you decide to write this book?
Oh, my grandmother, who years ago, when I was in my mid-20s, had what people then called senile dementia. They didn't use the language of
Yes.
Alzheimer's per se, but she definitely had a progressive dementing condition. And I would go into a nursing home, uh, and even though she was quite limited in terms of any speech communication, she was still present, and I could do assisted oral feeding with her. And I know that sometimes she would just perk up a little bit, and out of nowhere, she would refer to me by name. So back in those days, I came to the conclusion that even though people may be quite forgetful, we can never speak of them as gone, as absent, as a husk, a shell, as dead, and so forth. We have to recognize that underneath this breakdown in communication and this silence, there is still, if you will, uh, a human identity, a certain kind of, refer to it if you want, as a soul, but something that transcends the brain and can surprise us with moments of lucidity. And that's very well reported and even now being studied through grants from the NIH. They call it paradoxical lucidity.
Wow. Science is phenomenal. And I say this because when you talk about the person, and in your book, you use this expression that I find quite interesting, the inner person.
Mm-hmm.
And you say that because when we observe the caring for patients who lost their memory or experiencing Alzheimer, there is a disconnect.
Yes. Well, what's so fascinating is that you can bring people back, even when they seem awfully far gone, through the use of personalized music. This is a movement that swept the nation. Uh, in Canada, they give everybody with Alzheimer's dementia a free iPod, and they can play music that they identify with from earlier in life. And it tends to bring them back into themselves. They become somatic and rhythmic, and then, believe it or not, will chime in a little bit. So we have many examples of that, which are in the book. There's also the Alzheimer's choir called the Unforgettables in New York, where caregivers and people with dementia who really have struggled will come together, and in singing a song and even performing it, they do a performance every 6 weeks or so. And this is a movement across the country. These individuals really come into themselves. And then after these experiences, they're more emotionally alive. They are able to communicate verbally to some degree, at least for a brief period of time. And it's incredibly inspiring for the caregivers, because what they see is that, hey, grandma's still there. Grandpa's still there. They're not gone.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what we need to recognize. I think that Kardec would have agreed with that, because he understood that there was more to mind than cells and tissue.
Perfectly said. I agree with you. When I read about the way you say we should relate or connect with the Alzheimer's person, the patient, it goes deep into seeing that there is more than the physical body, as you're saying.
Right.
And it makes a difference. So there are ways in which science is identifying. So through arts,
Mm-hmm.
poetry, music, as you're saying, and that can really rescue or bring out again that inner person, right?
And help us to recognize that they are still part of a shared humanity. So, we in the Western world, we emphasize what I call linear rationality. I don't want to get technical, but the philosophers, Kant, Locke, and so forth. In other words, a person is really fully protected under the umbrella of do no harm and fully worthy of our kindness if they can propose rational plans and operationalize them into the future. That gives them so-called agency.
Mhm.
But in Germany in the 1930s, that became a real problem because the standard way of thinking about people with dementia was as quote unquote life unworthy of life,
Mhm.
as useless eaters. And there was a program in 1939 in Germany where Aryans, not people from discriminated against races, that was a terrible thing in and of itself, but Aryans were taken out of asylums, some of them with developmental disabilities, some of them with dementias, and they were left to freeze in the snow or in cold vats of ice water in the hypothermia experiments. This was called T4, Tiergestrasse 4 in Munich. Then they were brought in dead to the asylums and warmed up at different heating gradients and different mediums, water, hot air, and the like. And the Nazis said, well, we want to know at what point it becomes futile to send rescue squads into the North Atlantic to go after our downed pilots. Of course, this was hideous. And even the Germans at the time struggled against this. And after a year and a half, the T4 project was stopped. But the very people who perpetrated this went directly to the death camps of Dachau and Auschwitz, and they continued the hypothermia experiments on other vulnerable populations. So the point is that it's very easy in a society that so values economic productivity, the fast-paced life, careerism, all the things that you can't really ultimately put all your value on, because what matters so much is love and connection and presence and caring and compassion. So my book takes the title of Deeply Forgetful People because unlike dementia, which can be a very derisive term, we don't want to be demented. Politicians talk about a demented adversary and so
Yes.
forth, which drives me nuts. But it really is a term of derision. It's a decline. All it is a decline from a former mental state, dementia, deeply forgetful. Well, we all have our moments.
Yeah, we do.
I was in the parking lot and I forgot where I parked my car the other day, and I had to ask a medical student, "Hey, do you know where I parked my car?" They had no idea. But there was the worst day was when I actually wondered if I'd driven to work. So it's one thing to forget where you parked your car. It's another thing to forget if you have a car that's parked. That's important anyway. But the thing is that we all have moments when we lose connection. We don't know who that person is quite. We're embarrassed. We can't remember their name. So our experiences are not altogether different than the people with so-called dementia. And there's so many wonderful illustrations of individuals with dementia who, through the right stimulation, come into their own.
Mhm.
So I tell a story in the book of a great neurologist friend of mine, Joseph Michael Foley. He was the president of the American Neurological Society and the American Society of Neurosciences. He's passed away now. We went to a nursing home in Chardon, Ohio, which is, off in northeastern Ohio. And we read a little bio sketch on the wall about a fellow named Jim on the wall of his room. And I knew a few things about him from the sketch. And then we went out into, this is a special care unit where there are usually 20 or 25 people with dementia. They're cared for with special concern about architectural design and lots of different details. So I asked the nurse, "Can you show me where Jim is?" She showed me Jim, and I said, "Jim, how are you? Let's sit down." And we sat down, and I asked him how his sons were, and he couldn't communicate. That was actually a bad question, because I should have asked him, where are David and where's John? Because that would have cued him. You're supposed to communicate that way, and there's a real skill to it. He still couldn't communicate with me, but he had a twig in his hand, and it was a white painted twig about this long.
Mm-hmm.
And he placed it in my hands. And when he did that, Vanessa,
Mm.
he smiled. And if a smile was electric, that whole place would have caught on fire. And then he said to me, God is love.
Oh.
And that was it. And then I returned the twig to him. And I went to the nurse. Joe was there for all this. And I asked the nurse, so what's going on with Jim? And she said he grew up on a farm, and he loved his father very much. His father was a Christian, and gave the boy a chore in the mornings, which was to bring kindling in for the fireplace.
Oh.
So he had gone back, like a lot of these individuals do, to that time in their personal history
Mm-hmm.
that they've most associated with tender, loving care and attachment. So then Jim wandered off, and there was an old rag doll on the floor. Now, this thing had to have been 100 years old. It was all filthy and beat up, and you could hardly recognize it, but it was one of those rag puppet dolls that you would put on your hand if you were a little girl. And he bent down, he picked it up. I couldn't understand what he was doing. And he walked to the corner of this rather large room very slowly. He had gait issues. And there was a woman who was in a little chair in the corner, and she was whimpering and crying. And he took the doll, and he placed it on her lap, and he touched her shoulder, and he wandered off. And it turns out it was her doll, and she stopped crying. So he was much more sensitive to his environment than you might necessarily think. But you have to notice it. You've got to really observe it. You've got to be there, and you've got to take an interest. And you can't just brush him off as well. He's gone. You had to really be curious, be gently curious.
Yes.
About what was going on with Jim.
But as you were talking about the lapses of memory that we all may have, even children do. My daughter's just only 8, and sometimes I say, Virginia, come here, and she's like, Mom, wait a second, and then I wait. I said, you ready? And she's like, I was going to my bedroom, and then I forgot. Mm-hmm. I forgot what I had to do there. So I find, it's a relief for me, because it happens to me sometimes. But today especially, I want to say to everybody, we owe a moment of gratitude to Thich Nhat Hanh, because when I talk about mindfulness, it reminds me of the great Thich Nhat Hanh, who discarnated just this past night at 95, and he has really led humanity. I've learned a lot from his books. And when you're talking about observing the person, you have to be mindful. You have to be in the present. Mm-hmm. Mindfulness changes everything. But I want to, certainly the family members, the caregivers need to learn mindfulness. But a big question for us is, how hard is it for many people to be mindful when the present is not pleasant? Right?
Exactly. Yes. And the challenges are very real. There are all kinds of complex logistical issues involved in caregiving, and very few people are ready for it. It breaks into their lives like a tsunami wave through the back porch. Suddenly we're talking about Alzheimer's and so forth, and it becomes painful because a person does lose certain aspects of their personal identity, even to the point of forgetting names. Although, again, that's relatively sporadic, because you have to be open to the possibility that on a given moment, somebody will remember your name. And that's what happened to me, Yes. But you kind of have to connect with them first. And that doesn't happen all the time, but it can happen, and it's widely reported. So Yeah, it's difficult. And mindfulness, meditation, um, centering the self, controlling negative, destructive emotions and stressful
Mhm.
emotions is incredibly important, because there's no question in the literature that caregivers do struggle with stress, and they do have a somewhat higher depression rate than the general population. However, if they get some respite support for
Mhm.
just one afternoon a week for a couple of hours,
Oh,
that elevation in depression diminishes to baseline.
oh, wow.
And we knew that way back when, even 20 years ago. I used to do a lot of activism with the Alzheimer's Association. We did an event in Washington, D.C., um, and we went up to our congressmen's offices and so forth, and we were asking for support for respite care. Just to, it's not the biggest expense.
Mhm.
And the unanimous response was, well, we can't do that because it costs money, and if we give that to Alzheimer's caregivers, when will it stop?
Mhm.
So we have a healthcare system that will spend literally anything to rescue somebody from death. Here in our intensive care units, it's $7,000 a day plus X number of more dollars. It's incredible how much we spend, even when people are really at death's door. Um, and we're a rescue oriented system, but we don't seem to quite realize the importance of quality of life for individuals who become dependent, who are in need of continual care, and the caregivers themselves who need our support and our help. That's how I broke into the Alzheimer's field
Mhm.
in Cleveland in about 1990. When was that? Wow, even not 1991. Doing respite care for caregivers in Cleveland Heights, about one day a week, and seeing what I could learn. And most of my work really comes out of those experiences and dialogues with Alzheimer's families and patients, and it's been a very interesting ride.
It's so interesting, but you're talking about quality of life, and it reminds me of a part of your book that touches the importance of the physical dimension, like caring for diet,
Mhm.
regular exercise, and most recently, Dr. Dean Ornish,
Mhm.
who leads the field of lifestyle medicine, has just published this book, Undo It, with his wife, which talks about the importance of it, not specifically to Alzheimer's patients, but we know that it's a big part of it. Would you like to share more in that regard, please?
Yeah, so there is a good recent literature on how walking, especially for older adults, is protective, cognitively protective. And so let's just be really clear about this. So many times people have what is called a mixed diagnosis. They don't just have Alzheimer's, which is associated with the shrinking of the hippocampus, a memory
Mm-hmm.
part of the brain, but they also have small stroke events. This is called multi-infarct dementia, little teeny stroke events um, that you wouldn't necessarily notice in the white matter of the brain. And so we call that vascular dementia because it's more stable. It doesn't progress quite like Alzheimer's, but it will plateau and it can be very severe. And then there are other people, who have dementia for different reasons, because dementia is a syndrome. It's a collection of symptoms caused by one disease or another. 100 years ago, the major cause of dementia was actually syphilis.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So walking and exercise is important. Also, stress is important. There have been a lot of interesting things. In fact, Deepak Chopra has done some very nice work on this. I went to a meeting at Berkeley about, oh my goodness, it had to have been 22, 23 years ago. There was not a neurologist there. These were the top neurologists of Alzheimer's disease. There was not one neurologist there who believed that stress contributed to Alzheimer's disease.
Oh, wow.
Now you won't find a neurologist who doesn't believe that.
Oh,
And that's because, there are three negative effects of chronic stress. One is metabolites are converted to fatty acids, so you get a lot of vascular issues. The other one is you get a slowing down of the wound healing process by about, say, 15%. And then the third one is you have hippocampal atrophy. So in some respects, you have to think about Alzheimer's as a condition partly influenced by
stress.
our anxious society. Okay, so here's an interesting thing, African Americans in this country have a higher incidence of Alzheimer's than whites. It's
Oh,
about 2 to 1,
wow.
which is really tragic. But if you go to Africa and you look at people with the same genome, more or less, who are living in these communities where they have lots of support, where they're happy, where everybody's helping other people, it's good to be good, where you have that kind of world, they actually don't have any progressive dementia among the elderly. So that's an interesting contrast. There's something about the stress of probably poverty, of lack of access to care, of feeling the inferiority of a class society, which is a constant pressure. So this definitely is a significant piece of the story.
Wow. Wow. So then when it comes to this is dramatic what you're sharing with us. So it just raises awareness in so many, and especially for people who want to reach out, volunteer, more reasons to do so. But in regards to food, the wrong food could cause a dramatic stress in the body as well.
I agree. So there's a very well-known research team at Columbia University. This is Mary Sano in particular, and her team looked at diet across Greater New York. In Greater New York, there's a lot of different ethnic communities,
Yes.
and what they found is that the Mediterranean diet, somewhat conclusively, it's been replicated, seems to be preventive. Isn't that interesting? So if you're having, green vegetables, vegetables that are above the ground level, not potatoes
Yeah.
necessarily,
No, no.
although I'm half Irish, so I like potatoes. But if you have that, and if you have other aspects of the Mediterranean diet, including the berries, blueberries, blackberries, raspberries, salads. These things are quite much improvements over the standard diet that we might pick up in a casual American
Yeah,
context.
like meat and starch.
Yeah, so meat and starch, yeah, and I think that can be important. Also, there are well-known effects of periodic fasting
Mm-hmm.
on the brain. So when you move away from a starch-related diet to more of a ketonic type diet, there is a clarity that people report, a mental clarity, and an improvement of memory as well. So if you can just in your day-to-day life be a little careful about gobbling down carbohydrates left and right,
Yeah.
that can help you. I would also stay away from certain fast food
Yes.
places.
Yes, and you're right. All the studies point to that direction. So healthy diet and exercise can be very helpful in regards to giving greater quality to the life of Alzheimer's patients, right?
Yeah, yeah. And the pharmacology is not very convincing. I mean, I don't want to say too much because I know some people, exceptionally do get something out of certain of the medications around. But in general, I'm not going to go into that. But I'm very much involved in it and have been engaged with research over the years. But nothing. There's no magic bullet. You might get a slight alleviation of certain symptoms for a brief period of time. So, for example, with the current most popular drug, I won't name it per se, but it's called a cholinesterase inhibitor. Don't write that down. Okay. But, when we were looking at that material years ago at Case Western, if you had someone with mild dementia, mild Alzheimer's, and you put a glass in front of them with water, they might have 2 sips instead of just 1 before they wander away and forget about the glass being on the table.
Mm-hmm.
And that was pretty much it. Those were the kinds of things that we looked at. But then after just, a month or two, even that benefit evaporates because you're not doing anything about the underlying decline of the condition. So as one of the people who discovered the whole cholinergic hypothesis has said, it's like treating a brain tumor with aspirin. Aspirin can help with a brain tumor. It can alleviate certain pressures, but it's not going to do anything to the underlying progression of the tumor itself. And so there's nothing out there that stops this. And the NIH has admitted that, and companies have come along. Again, I'm not going to mention them by name, but I actually consult for a couple of them, and I read them the riot act. I say, would you try to look at how this actually affects patients and not just some little study of the biochemical richness or lack thereof of a particular particle that we don't even think is associated necessarily with the cause of the disease. So they're not looking at the right thing, and nobody knows what the model is. Nobody knows what the cause of this is. It turned out it wasn't the acetylcholine diminution. It's not the so-called amyloid plaques. Some people say, well, it's inflammation in the brain,
Yes.
way upstream, even years before that.
Yeah.
And so all these things we're seeing in the brain are just downstream after effects. So the scientists don't even know what to go after, frankly.
Yeah.
And Alzheimer himself. So I actually flew. You'll love this story. I went to Lilly Neuroscience in Indianapolis, and I used to consult with them a little bit. And we actually flew on their Lear jet to Markbrecht, Germany, which is a small town, beautiful town in Germany, about an hour or two from Nuremberg. And that's where Dr. Alzheimer was born. And Lilly had purchased his home, and it was now a conference site for people who wanted to do work on Alzheimer.
Wow.
So it turned out this was on the history of Alzheimer's disease, and we had the greatest experts in the world. And absolutely, Alzheimer himself in 1907, who discovered supposedly the first case of Alzheimer's disease, he didn't think he'd discovered a disease at all. He thought he had just observed a case of aging, of the aging brain, of senility. And he felt that if we all lived long enough, we would all have these problems. And so about 10 years ago, the epidemiologists in the US, like Dennis Evans, wanted to know, okay, so do people after a certain point, like say they hit 85, are they over the hump and then they're free of this threat? So they've looked at women who are in their late 90s, because there are more people who are living longer, at least to some degree. And those women actually have a much higher incidence of Alzheimer's than would otherwise be the case. About 60% of them have probable Alzheimer's disease. So it does seem to get more serious as people age. And, this is why I think the NIA, the National Institute on Aging at the NIH, is devoting like 70% of its budget now, Vanessa, to basic science of anti-aging, because they figure if aging is the major risk factor, and they're not doing too well with studies that specifically look at these illnesses of chronic illnesses of old age. Let's try to look at aging itself, but that raises a lot of problems intergenerationally and
Yeah.
so forth, et cetera. So I won't even go into that. But this is a big issue, and I think all that we can do about prevention. Lead is a factor.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of recent studies in public health point out that if you look at the history of Alzheimer's in our United States, in addition to aging, it correlates with lead exposure. So it and that would actually say something, I think, about the higher incidence among African Americans too, because they're more likely to live in a area of a city, for example, where there is lead in the water or whatever. So lead is potentially a factor, and I think a lot of people are coming around on that.
Yeah. As a psychologist, I know the great impact of emotions. You already talked about stress. I keep thinking about psychosomatics. I know in your book you're focused on the care, like giving dignity. But I still have this question inside of me. For example, I've been investigating, it's a family investigation. Like my great grandmother, they didn't say it was Alzheimer. I met her. She died at 98. And they said it was, she was just senile. But I recognized the features of Alzheimer. And then later, as she had so many kids, my grandmother, she's still living, she's 94, and
Okay.
she's twin sister. And my great uncle died of Alzheimer, and she has other sisters with Alzheimer.
Yes.
And then when I talk about, I know her, how she's very calm, very spiritual, very caring, very compassionate, very active as well. To date, though she's 94, you look at her picture and everybody says, wow, she looks like she's 60, 70. But her emotions, she's very stable, very calm. She's very caring, compassionate. Not saying that her brother or other sisters were not. But I asked her, I said, Grandma, can you tell me? And of course, she's so kind, she's not going to say anything bad. But I say, can you tell me what could possibly be the differences between you and your brother? So in his case, he was more like money driven. He was more little, very rigid. It was his generation. And in her sister's case, she was very concerned about what people would think about the family, etc. So I was just wondering about some psychosomatics, if you can say anything in the studies you have seen.
Well, I can say a few things. One, first thing with regard to family history.
Yeah.
So, given current life expectancy in the United States, which is, mid 70s and a little bit beyond, about 15% of individuals can anticipate difficulties with probable Alzheimer's disease. That's a lot of people. You have a 15% risk. However, in Japan, where people live on average to be about 88 or 89, the risk factor is much greater. So about even 11 or 12% of people in Japan, total population, have Alzheimer's disease, which is a big problem. But the thing is that you can tell a lot by just family history. If you have a first-degree relative, let me rephrase this. At age 60, there's about 1% of people have probable Alzheimer's. It doubles every 2 years.
Okay.
So at age 65, it's probably 2%. At age 70, it's probably 5%. At age 75, it's probably 11 or 12%. At age 80, it'll hit higher levels. But of course, people are dying in that period, and so you don't see the necessary rise. But if you have a first degree relative, and that only means a sibling, a mother or a father who had Alzheimer's, that does increase your risk. It's not astronomical as an increase. You might go from, 12 or 13% risk to 20 or 25% risk, but it's significant. But if you have other relatives scattered around your clan and whatever, that's not irrelevant. It's just the first degree relatives that make a difference. And the genes are not causative. They don't, they're susceptibility genes. And so there's a gene called the Apolipoprotein E4 allele. Don't anybody write that down. But I did write an article in JAMA about that many years ago from my desk at Case Western, and had an NIH grant on that. So I study the genetics pretty carefully. But if, basically, you're at a little greater risk if you have this one genetic allele, and you're at a lower risk if you have a couple of others, apolipoprotein E2 or E3. But really, the genetics doesn't tell you anything for certain. There are maybe 1 or 2% of people who have an absolutely causative, what we call autosomal dominant gene. These are the presenilin genes. And if they have the gene, which they inherit, they will definitely get the illness. And they'll probably get it at about age 40, and it'll proceed rapidly. And it's usually connected, because you're a psychologist, with ubiquitous behavioral difficulties, aggression and the like. But with the normal people who are not early onset, where they might begin to show some problems at age 60 or 70, and where behavioral problems might affect maybe 20% of them as they get on in the course of the illness, the genetics are really irrelevant. If you have a family history, just know that if these are first-degree relatives, you've got a little higher risk in that category.
Yeah, that's for sure. But when a patient receives the diagnosis, we know, like when we're visiting here, the local care place for Alzheimer's patients, there are sections. So there's one that is just beginning with it, and there's one with the severe state already, so at a later stage. But in your book, you talk about a way to help the patient understand what the diagnosis means, and what to do, and you talk about tender loving that can make a difference in the disease progression.
Yes, it can.
What is that?
Yeah. So let me just say, don't think of Alzheimer's as neurologically determined. In other words, recognize that, like many other conditions, environment and emotional support can make a difference.
Yes.
Because we now have things called, I won't go into this technically, but
Epigenetics.
Yeah, epigenetics, and the brain can actually be affected by emotional states. So to a significant degree, I think we have to realize that unlike the sort of hardcore scientific molecular model that would say, this is all pre-programmed biologically, I think it's much more subtle. And therefore, if we do the right kinds of interventions, not that these are going to be miraculous, but they can make a difference. So we can make an impact that is not based on pharmacology, but it's based on the way we interact. So when people are sundowning in the afternoon, when they get tired, there are tricks of the trade. There are things that we can do to relieve some of the stress on them, and of course indirectly on ourselves.
And going back a little bit to genetics, it's so interesting because we spiritists, we understand genetics as the byproduct of the baggage. It comes from so many lives imprinted in the spiritual body, and then imprinted in the physical body, predisposing us to illnesses that may be triggered or not, depending on life situations, which we call here the effects of epigenetics. So Besides that, you are reinforcing to us that the human connection, if I may say this way, when you say loving care, the human connection being restored and being there may help in preventing the dramatic escalation
Yeah,
of.
I think we have to be open-minded about these things. And to the extent that there is a genetic component, I mean, one of the neurologists I was talking with recently said that genetics, stress, diet, a lot of different things kind of feed into this. But certainly genetics is one of the venues of susceptibility or protection. But given epigenetics and the way in which genetic influences can be passed down from one generation to the next, it is possible to think of Alzheimer's and many other illnesses of old age as somewhat influenced in that intergenerational sense. Now, I don't have any science to back that up, except that epigenetics is well accepted now
Yes,
and needs to be taken quite seriously. So
yes,
we don't know. But what is the mind? I mean, to me, Vanessa, one of the big questions is what is a mind? So I guess I'm a little bit like Kardec. I wrote God and Love 180,
I know.
and and Larry Dossey wrote the foreword. And I've never been convinced. I've been studying philosophy of mind since I can remember. I've never been convinced that mind is just an epiphenomenal. It's just peripheral to brain.
No,
So I knew when I was at the University of Chicago, I knew Sir John Eccles, who won the Nobel Prize for all his work on synapses. He didn't think that brain could produce mind. I've known many, many people who have felt that way. Joe Foley himself, the famous neurologist. I mean, obviously they're intertwined, but that's why you can really ask what's going on here. So when a person has a moment of paradoxical lucidity, when suddenly they're insightful, you ask yourself, okay, is that just some little remnant synaptic tissue in the brain that's somehow firing off and somehow letting a people get back in touch with who they are, with their personality, with parts of their history? Or is it more likely that somehow or another, who they are, that history of themselves is present in a way that is non-material?
yes,
So this is why all the great religious traditions, the Upanishads and the like, all say it's mind before matter, right? So the supreme being is mind, and Kardec believed this.
yes.
The supreme being is mind, and exists beyond space and time,
Beyond space.
and it's from the supreme being who's interested in having some relationality with other free beings who are capable of love and creativity.
Yes,
That's the Hindu thing. That's why, namaste, I honor the divine in you as you honor the divine in me. That divine is never gone.
no,
It's never gone. So I was talking with a wonderful old African-American mentor of mine, Pastor Otis Moss, who was a right-hand person to Martin Luther King. And his sister passed away of Alzheimer's in Detroit about a month and a half ago. And he's a great guy. He's about 85 now, or 86. And we were talking on the phone. And I said, is your sister communicating? And he said, no. She can surprise us a little bit though, but not really. And so I said, well, don't ever think that she's gone. I said, no, he was the head of the institutional Olivet Baptist Church in Cleveland. He had a huge national following. Oprah identifies him as her major spiritual mentor. This is Otis Moss. You can look him up. Amazing guy. And I said, my guess is that your sister, if this is before she died, has already gone down to the Amtrak station. This is what I said. And she's got one foot on that blessed train for glory.
yeah,
And she may actually be in, as they say in the African American world, Beulah land right now, even though she's still here with you physically. And then I talked about thinking of her as deeply forgetful, but not as gone.
No.
And then he wrote back to me. He wrote a beautiful email, which I kept. And it said, Stephen, I was the president of the board of Morehouse College, and I knew many people, Howard Thurman, many of the great African-American spiritualist types. And they always said the way to expand the beloved community is with the right language. And he said, you've given us a language to include these people, deeply forgetful.
Yes. Which is caring. Because, for us spiritists, even for people in coma, as one of the last topics I want to talk to you about in your book, people in coma, we have several books that talk about apparently the person is not there, but we have evidence through several mediums, several from different areas in the world that identify the spirit that is connected, and all the research on NDEs as well that talk about the presence of something beyond the physical body that is connected there, and how they perceived everything, though they could not communicate with us. And I connect that with Alzheimer's disease at a later stage.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah. So again, this is where philosophy of mind really comes into play. And I am very much a Hindu and a Buddhist. I'm an Episcopalian, but I could also be an excellent spiritist.
I know. That's why you're here time and again.
and I read Kardec and I take him seriously. But for me, the mind, our minds are gifts. We each have some small bit of this infinite divine mind that is within us. And we have personal identity, but our mind is not something that is really our own. Again, I use the word gift. Our mind is a gift. And so that's why people have such incredible premonitions and creative moments where suddenly, well, there's so many examples, even Einstein, but people who have insights that they feel were given to them, that almost invaded their consciousness and that didn't really come from them. Or they have these incredible experiences like the poet Austen had at Oxford, where he describes this beautifully. It's in God and Love on Route 80, where he's sitting at one of the colleges there with some friends, and they're in chairs on the lawn. And he's not particularly close with them, but they're friends, and they're not drinking. And then suddenly he feels invaded by an energy. And he looks at these people, and now they're not just people in the ordinary sense, but every one of them he feels has an infinite value.
Yes.
And he celebrates that. And he uses the metaphor of invasion. So that is something that many people experience. And so we have to recognize that there's a mystery to the mind. That's all I really want to say here. I don't want to prove anything.
I understand.
But, there's so much synchronicity that goes on. People who just, can't believe that this perfect person was here at this perfect time saying exactly the perfect thing. Jung talked about synchronicity, that somehow we're more cherished in our lives than we realize, and that these perfect meetings and encounters are there for a reason. So if you believe that our minds are part of something much larger, then they don't go away.
No.
They never go away. So I went with Joe Foley. We went to a town in the middle of Ohio, Mount Vernon, Ohio, for anybody who's from Ohio and who's a spiritist. This is not too far from Kenyon College, where Paul Newman used to hang out. I knew him pretty well because he lived in Shaker Heights for a while. I grew up in Shaker Heights, where we were living at the time. But Joe and I went to the geriatric psychiatric hospital in Mount Vernon, which is run by the state of Ohio, and they have a special unit for people with Down syndrome who get older, because most people with Down syndrome, when they hit their 50s, they have a deterioration. And people say, well, it's related to a certain chromosome, which I won't go into, would probably be chromosome 23. And so they have dementia. And it's oddly enough, in the middle of Ohio, there was a community of Hindu doctors and nurses, and they have moved there just to take care of these people. So Joe and I took, a subset, not all of them obviously, but a subset, out to a pizza place in Gambier, which is the town where Kenyon is located. There's only one restaurant there. It's a pizza place. And Newman would sometimes just out of the blue walk in there and order a slice, So we had a big table and we were eating pizza. And Joe and I asked them, this is in the book, so what makes you care so meticulously and so diligently about these individuals? I mean, it's just unbelievable how caring you are. And what they said to us without any exception was, namaste. We honor the divine in them, just like we honor the divine in anyone else. They don't lose that divinity.
Oh, wow.
And so that's what I want to say. It doesn't mean that we have to keep people alive forever, that we don't need to make judgments about quality of life and so forth. But it does mean that we can't write these people off.
I agree.
Or abuse them, or think of them as somehow inferior. So I have on my wall here a letter from His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Can I show it to you?
Yes.
Okay. I'm actually going to pull it down.
Sure.
If I don't break it. So this is from His Holiness.
Oh, wow.
And the actual identification thing is from a city in India called Bangalore.
Yes.
And I went there to do a conference on the deeply forgetful at the Indian Institute for Advanced Studies. And this was in, oh my goodness, 2015, 7 years ago. And the whole talk was about changing the language game, deeply forgetful, putting aside hypercognitive values where we railroad people because they're not cognitively up to snuff and so forth. And so I was giving this talk, and believe it or not, in walked His Holiness out of the blue, unannounced, because I guess he hangs around Bangalore a bit, I mean, if you go to the Bangalore airport, there's a lot of, people with saffron robes and stuff. So he didn't interrupt me at all, and he just listened, and then I said, yeah, I mean, there's no reason to think, if you really understand the nature of mind, that they're gone, that they're no longer worth our respect, that they no longer have human dignity, because they still have minds. They may not be communicating well, but we can't say that they're gone, that they're not there. So he put his hand down on the table and he said, yes, there is no reason to think that a person who is more forgetful is of less value than anyone who isn't.
Oh, wow.
End of story. So this is the end of this. He says,
That's it.
he endorses the work, and the book is endorsed by him, but he says, their consciousness, their interconnectedness, it's there. And, they can be incredibly creative. I mean, people, the artist Willem de Kooning, the abstract expressionist who did all that kind of wild, intense stuff, he spent the last 14 years of his life with Alzheimer's. He was diagnosed at Cornell Medical Center in New York. And for 13 and a half years, he still painted in a loft in Greenwich Village. He had a liaison, and he'd rise up, sporadically and put his brush in the acrylic and go up to this canvas and he'd paint stuff. And they actually had a posthumous exhibit of his work while he was deeply forgetful. And a lot of the critics trashed it, honestly. They said, it doesn't have the depth, the complexity, the richness. It's an embarrassment. But the one reviewer I really liked, who I think was from the New Yorker, said, let's stand back here. This is a man who had Alzheimer's disease for 14 years. And for 13 and a half years, he knew who he was. He identified symbolically with his brushes. And the painting that he did, she said, was it wasn't quite Georgia O'Keeffe, but it was really beautiful. It was much lighter colors and sort of flower-like. And I kind of thought when I saw it that he was disinhibited. Maybe he'd spent most of his life thinking, I don't do nothing for nothing. He got a lot of fistfights in front of the Cafe Wa on Bleecker Street. He was known for that, and we live in this ideology where, I can't be free. This is where we lose our natural compassion and generosity. But somehow or another, as he became demented, I think maybe he forgot about those erroneous myths. They are erroneous, because we're much more interconnected.
And actually, what do we know about the brain? Though I'm a neuroscientist myself, as a scientist, we still don't know much of even the physical brain, how the potential of it all. So we would say for us, the spiritists here who embrace science, but know that science is not there yet, we would say the spirit is there, connected, and the dignity is the least we can give to people, because at the end of the day, we are all, for us, children of God, as you said.
Yeah, totally true.
The divine in us, right?
Yeah.
And
that's Kardecian medical ethics.
You summarized it all. Dr. Post, I would love to spend like many hours with you because it's clear there is so much, but I want to tell people they can read your book. The date?
Well, it can be pre-ordered now. It's on Amazon. So, but the title is Dignity for Deeply Forgetful People.
Yeah, I'm just putting it here.
Yeah, and I've spent like 30 years, going all over the world. I've had a lot of influence in Japan and in all different kinds of places.
Yes.
And practical stuff about treatment decisions, but more deeply, it's just about what we're talking about. It's really a spiritist book in that sense that, what happens if you really take the idea that mind is more than matter, that mind is before matter. Yeah. That, in fact, if you take these traditions rightly, matter is derived from mind.
That's what it is.
Yeah.
Exactly. You summarized it all. And I agree with you. We need to care till the last minute because, as we understand, Kardec said it right on 1857 in the Spirit's book. The last minute of breath, there is a lot happening to the spirit that is going to impact in the continuation of life and even future lives. So we can't simply say X somebody out and say they're gone. Why are they here? They are suffering. That's not how we see it. We see many blessings, even in those stages of progressive Alzheimer or dementia. There's a lot going on. And I would add, I know science cannot talk much about it, but we would say spiritual care and energy medicine certainly can be a helping hand as well.
Can be. There's a chapter in the book called "Is Grandma Still There?" Because a lot of little kids have asked me that question, is Grandma still there? And the answer is, as far as we know. Because how could anybody be so arrogant as to think that we can definitively say, okay, she's gone?
I think it's more of our problem, Dr. Post, because when I visit the people who have Alzheimer it's like 2 blocks away from my house. When I see them, even the ones that are at the most severe cases, you can see the person right there. And it reminds me, Dr. Post, when I had Virginia as a baby, and parents would say, you talk to your baby? I said, yes, I do. Why? But the baby doesn't talk back to you. And I said, but that doesn't matter. I can perceive the response right here. So I think it's more of our problem as caregivers than the person who is being cared for. And it happens as they are babies. into the aging years as well. Dr. Post, I would love to have you back. I want to talk to you more, bring more of you. I'm sure our audience wants more of you, but I have to wrap it up. Would you like to
Okay.
say a final statement before we wrap it up?
Yeah. There's a passage in the writings of St. Paul. Nothing can separate us from the love of God. And that includes, quote unquote, dementia, deep forgetfulness, and the like. Nothing can separate us from the love of God. That would be my last comment.
Masterful. Thank you for the blessing of your presence. And I'll be in touch with you because we certainly need more of your wisdom, of your works, of your research. Thank you so much, Dr. Post.
It's always a pleasure. I so enjoy these conversations with you. They're memorable, always memorable.
Thank you, Dr. Post. A big hug to you from all of us.
Okay. Thank you, spiritists.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, friends. See you next time. Next week, we have more about planetary transition and more stories to share with you. Stay tuned because Kardec Radio has always more to nourish our souls.
Okay.